Welcome to this edition of Rule Breakers, and with me today is Steven Pemberton, who is with the CWI. I won't attempt to pronounce that in Dutch, but it
Dutch.
is the Dutch Computer Science and Mathematics Research Institute. Is that correct, Steven?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. National Research Center for Mathematics and Computer Science.
It so happens that your interest in some of the stuff that you have been involved in directly tracks some of the things that I've been most interested in and involved in over the years. All the way from your involvement in Python or ABC back in the day, through to your involvement with things like cascading style sheets and so on, and the W3C. It's great to have you on and to hear your perspective on all of those things, Stephen.
Great. Well, it's good to be here.
Great. Where would you like to start?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay. Well,
uh,
here's
uh,
one possibility for you. Tell me if this is crazy or not. Um, I know one of your recent projects is Invisible XML,
that's right.
and it just occurred to me when I went thinking about the history of Python and then ABC, and one of the things that ABC I understand, uh, one of the things Guido van Rossum picked up on was the use of indentation to represent structure. And it did strike me that it's a sort of it's almost an invisible XML type idea, that rather than have open curly bracket and close curly bracket and or begin and end and so on, that you would use the indentation to represent the nesting. Is that crazy?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I would exactly call it crazy, but the point of ABC originally, at least when it was first being designed, was to be a beginner's programming language
Hmm.
for people who hadn't programmed before, and that includes lots of things like we left out the fact that there are limits on integers, for instance. I mean, we made integers. Well, in fact, everything didn't have. There were no limits at all. With the idea being that then you'd have to explain things like computer architecture and so on. And for a beginner, why can't a computer get higher than 30,000 so many or
Right.
whatever? So we thought, well, we'll just leave all those things out and just let people program without having to worry about details of hardware and so on.
Right.
And one of the ideas was also that to encourage people to use indentation.
Hmm.
And so we thought, well, what better way than to actually require the indentation so the indentation really reflects the nesting.
Right.
So
Right.
that's where the idea came from, really.
Right. 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 Um, and in my head, it also triggers thoughts of things like tag minimization in good old SGML that led to XML. That SGML had all sorts of rules or clever things that you could do if you were so inclined to try and reduce the amount of explicit structural information that you would need to
Y-
put into the document.
That's true, and actually, somebody just this week, well, last week I organize a conference annually here in Amsterdam called Declarative Amsterdam, and one of the talks was about IXML, Invisible XML, which you just mentioned, um, and somebody explicitly in a chat with me compared IXML with SGML, because SGML could leave lots of things out, and IXML in the way enables that again, but then with XML. It's not how I had thought of it, but
Right.
it was an interesting thought pattern from that person.
Right. Right. One of the things that always struck me about SGML is that it contained a whole bunch of really interesting ideas, but they were all kind of smashed together. Uh, Whereas the idea of invisible XML as a preprocessor really appeals to me just because of the separation of concerns. It's a sort of a standalone phase in the whole parsing process. Whereas with SGML, some of the there were feedback loops basically in various different places that made it quite difficult to reason about at times.
Yeah, you have to see me coming from a world of programming languages and parsing and compilers,
Mm,
which was my original background. When I saw XML, I just saw it as a parse tree, really. I mean, it is just
right.
a tree, a structured tree. So, I always in my head saw the link between a parse tree and and XML. And so for me, it was fairly obvious that you could just parse any document and turn that into a parse tree and then serialize that as XML. XML does a little bit more than that. It allows you to control the serialization, but that's where the idea came from. It was just in my head. I saw XML as a sort of parse tree. Um, so
Right.
I see XML as a useful thing for telling computers where structure is, but actually the structure's already there. It's only implicit. And IXML allows you to say what the structure is in a document and then make that explicit in
Right. Right.
serialization.
It's interesting. Um, one of the things I saw quite recently from the AI world is because token counting now is a big part of the whole, dollar and cents aspects of using these things,
Yeah.
that there seems to be a reemergence of interest in, really sparse markup because you can reduce the token counts and reduce your costs as a consequence. So the wheel seems to have come full circle to a degree.
Yeah, I suppose you're right there. It's kind of crazy, really, that you have to worry about that sort of thing. I mean, it's
Yes.
like having to worry about what your largest integer is. It's not where you want to spend your time. You want to spend your time in meaningful things and not in ridiculous details like that. But
No,
that's
indeed,
that's
indeed, indeed.
that's that's where we're at the moment.
And I find sometimes, again, to your earlier point about people who are not, computer engineers or software people, I find that with lay people, um, oftentimes, one photograph or say one second of video, versus one, um, word processor document, like, in their minds becomes just, well, it's just one and one. Whereas from a byte count perspective, there's orders of magnitude differences between those. So to your point,
Yeah,
it seems a bit odd to be concentrating on the, say shaving bytes out of your
yeah.
your JSON returns from an AI.
It's like how one SMS message used to cost you the same as 1 minute of calling somebody, which was just so
Right.
completely ridiculous. And I think that the phone companies slaughtered the goose that laid the golden egg with that approach because
Indeed.
it was just completely nonsense,
Indeed.
charging as much for an SMS as for a minute of call.
Indeed. Indeed. Um, so were you when I mean, I associate with you when I hear about, X forms and the XHTML specification and cascading style sheets and so on. In my head, I'm envisaging, Stephen Pemberton, at the World Wide Web Consortium. But did you did you leave the CWI to work with the W3C? I know you're back with CWI now. You were always with CWI, is that right?
Yeah, yeah. I was seconded from CWI, so the W3C were basically paying CWI for my time. The thing was, well, so I mean, interesting bit of knowledge. Next Monday is the 37th anniversary of Europe being attached to the internet.
Oh,
And so I'm being interviewed on Dutch radio Monday about that.
oh, because you were first, wasn't that? Isn't that?
Exactly. I was the first user because the guy who set it all up was in the office next to me. And the day that it started running, he knocked on my office door. I knew it was coming, and he said, "Oh, the internet's up." And so I said, "Oh, great!" I was sitting at my computer, so I logged into a computer in New York just to try it out, and that's how I became the first user of the open internet in Europe. But the creation of the internet uh, enabled the creation of the World Wide Web. Uh,
Right.
And it's no surprise that a year after the internet was connected to Europe, that Tim Berners-Lee wrote that memo where he was suggesting a connected a connected information system, and so by 1991. He'd got something running. Now, at that time, I was doing research, apart from in programming languages, also in related areas to what the World Wide Web is, hypertext and things like that.
Right.
And I had we and my group had a system running that if you saw it now, you would say you would say it looked like a browser, and it had lots of things that we now recognize as being part of a browser, like an extensible data language. I wouldn't say a markup language, but an extensible data language, style sheets, hypertext, client-side scripting. So when the web came along, we all understood it, and that's how how and why we got involved. That when the first web conference happened in 1994, I ended up helping organize some workshops because we'd already been doing work in this area, and so we knew a lot of the issues, and so we knew what needed to be discussed, and we knew about style sheets and stuff like that. So that's how I got involved, but we were doing that work just as that ABC programming language. We were doing that work from the viewpoint of human computer interaction. How do you make computers easier to use? So we weren't looking to make an information system, but we were trying to make computers easier to use for the uninitiated user. So that was the direction we were coming in. I'd already been working for a decade with SIGCHI, which is the Special Interest Group of Computer Human Interaction. I was editor of their one of their magazines, for instance, for a good many years. So I was very much coming from a user interfaces viewpoint. HCI interests, parsing interests, hypertext, programming languages, those all came together in the web. And so when Tim Berners-Lee asked me to get involved with the then not yet existing web consortium, I said, yes, I'd love to. And so I chaired a couple of meetings. And that was then when they asked me to chair a couple of the working groups, and how I got seconded to the W3C.
Right. And where did the overall syntax concept for cascading style sheets come from?
Oh, well, that came out of Bert Bos and Håkon Lie. That I recently looked at a very early version which had a different sort of syntax, but recognizable. But clearly, those two together had already done a lot of discussion about a potential syntax, and so it was more a question once we'd started the CSS working group up of details and properties and stuff like that. But a lot of the syntax had already been decided on.
Right. Because I remember, from back in the SGML days, I was somewhat familiar with the goings on inside the high time standard. So that kind of informed how I was thinking about hypertext. And I remember some hypermedia people being horrified in the early days of when they saw ahref and what do you mean a link could just break?
Yeah.
But from the DISL side of it, the document style specification thing, it had that separation of concerns, I guess, of the transformation followed by the final presentation aspect of it. But I remember coming across Lisp. James Clark used Scheme in that, and I remember coming across Scheme in SoftQuad Author Editor as well, which was one of the early HTML authoring tools. And so in my head, Lisp was, or Lispy type syntaxes were the way to do those kinds of things. But I also remember an earlier thing back in the day, the Arbortext Epic Editor, which still exists, had a thing called FOSI, FOSI, which I think came from the US military, which was so an XML. Okay, it was SGML most, but it was an SGML type syntax for expressing how you wanted to style the document. But this whole idea of whether styling languages, should be in a separate syntax from XML itself. Little similar to what happened with Relax NG on the parsing side. Always intrigued me that, James Clark, when I spoke to him recently, was talking about the compact syntax and making it easy to write schemas. What are your thoughts on that whole idea?
Well, so in fact, my great dream is that we can use IXML to
Okay.
destroy this separation, that you have an abstract document and what syntax it's in doesn't really matter, because
Uh-huh.
once you've parsed it and got it into a structured format, then you can convert it to XML or can just use that structured document directly. So that
Mhm.
the distinction between different formats should be much less important than it is now. That is
Right.
so much a religious issue that, and
Right.
I mean, in my life, I've seen so many religious wars on things that are just not really important,
Right.
Fortran or Algol, or Vi or Emacs or JSON or XML. These are all, I have to say it, childish arguments that are not
Brilliant.
really important, and not getting to the core of the issue of what we're trying to do as a community, as a world, and
Right.
having
Right.
these stupid little wars over the format of your data, it distresses and exhausts me. And
I guess what you're saying is that the data model is the important thing. That it's yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
I mean, I call it the abstract
Right.
document, but yeah, the data, you can say the data model is the important thing, and if you want to represent that in one format and not another, go right ahead. I mean, we should be organizing the world so that you can do that, and that you're not being forced into one route or the other, but these things can still talk to each other.
Well, sounds great. How big a lift do you think that would be to achieve with IXML going forward?
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of people still have to properly get their head round what it's trying to achieve. That a lot of
Mhm.
people rightly see it as a way of getting data into XML. So the XML heads, as it were, they see this as a great way of getting data that's not in XML into an XML form, so that then they can do something with their XML tool chain, which is great. And I mean, I'm one of those in one sense, because in the design of X forms, I want to get any old data, and I don't want to have to keep changing my implementation. I can just supply a front end, which is IXML, and then get my data in, and then with round tripping, get the data back out again. Um, uh, so 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 the idea behind IXML, or a fundamental idea, is that it doesn't matter what format your data is in. You can always with IXML you can get it into an abstract document which you can then use in any way you want.
Right. But that have implications in terms of the expressive power that the IXML parser is going to require to get to that point.
Up to a point. I mean, these are things that we're still working on. I mean, there's a version of IXML that works well, and by using it, we're discovering use cases that it doesn't do well, and so now we're in big discussions about what needs to be added or changed in order to make the new use cases more achievable.
Right.
I mean, it is a context-free parser, so that restricts you in some senses to the sorts of languages that you can parse up
Hmm.
to a point. I mean, there are ways that you can get around that, but for example, a language that starts with the count of the number of things that are following, for instance, you can't parse that with context free. So that sort of format you can't deal with. But these are things that we're still working on, and I'm in general happy the way that it's going. I think that some people still concentrate too much on the tiny little details rather than the direction that we're trying to go on, and
Right.
looking at the big issues. But it's progressing. It's turned out to be useful. It's turned out to be used by immensely varied use cases, which I really hadn't thought about in the first place. I mean, somebody's used it for designing knitting patterns, and somebody's used it for dealing with messages in aerospace supply chains. Somebody has used it for designing art. Somebody has used it for analyzing the results of trials in the late Roman Empire. And it's just extraordinary the number of ways that people are using it. And, all the time I'm seeing new ways that, I
Right.
hadn't anticipated myself, because I was interested more in making more data accessible and usable, and not in use cases like that.
And it sounds fascinating. It's not something that I've kept up with myself. But I must fix that now, having spoken to you.
But I have 2 online tutorials which you can just you can follow online and do yourself. So
Okay,
just go to my homepage.
splendid. And is this work happening within the structure of the W3C? Is that
Well, yeah. I mean, unfortunately, W3C has ended its XML activity.
okay?
So there's no official place for these to happen, but they have these community groups which are meant for developing new technologies. So we've used that structure. So we have something now that could become a W3C standard if they were interested. And I mean, we've created our own invisible XML organization for storing the results, as it were, at the moment. But it's up to W3C. I mean, I'm not very happy with some of the things that W3C are doing nowadays. I mean, I'm giving away HTML, as far as I'm concerned, was a disaster and a mistake. That you should never give the development of a technology, in my opinion, especially one that's user-facing, to the people who implement it. Because they always think in terms of implementation terms, and not in terms of the user of that technology. And I mean, I feel this very much about programming languages, and that very many mistakes in programming, they're being designed by the people implementing them. And that was a thing that was very different with ABC when we were designing it, that we left implementation until after we designed the language. That's to say, we designed it so that it met the needs that we thought that the user would have. And I know in Algol 60 they did similar things. When they designed Algol 60, they didn't yet know how to implement it. I mean, they added recursive functions, for instance, into Algol 60 at a time that nobody knew how to implement recursive functions. And in fact, it was at the CWI that Dijkstra was working when he
Oh,
he wrote the first Algol 60 compiler, and designed, well, a number of things, operator precedence parsing, but also how you should implement recursive functions in a programming language.
I
So
did.
I think that's a really good approach
Hmm.
to ask, what do we need? And then don't say, well, we don't know how to implement that, so we won't add it. But to force yourself to implement it, having defined it. And and so what you see in a lot of programming languages are lots of stupid little corners that are only there because the implementer didn't know how to do differently. I mean, the reason that Pascal can only return simple values from functions is because they really didn't know how to return large values in a general way, and so they simplified the language, which, from a pragmatic point of view at the time, was good, but it's not the way that I believe that you should design things. I think, and this is again from a human-computer interaction perspective, design for the needs of your users.
Right.
don't and worry about the implementation later. And so I see that's a big fault in HTML5 rather than designing for the users. They've just said, well, if you need anything new, write it in JavaScript, add your own elements. Crazy. It's crazy. You know, we've got billions of people using creating pages, and suddenly they're unable to do that by hand because they're not programmers.
Right.
So the HTML5 people have looked at the world from the viewpoint of a programmer, and you know, if your only tool is as a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, and
Right.
uh,
Right.
and that's happened with HTML5. And I personally think HTML5 is a disaster. Um,
Okay.
they've done a lot of damage to the web in general. I mean, of course, they've enabled lots of things, but I think they've enabled them in the wrong way, and that's because of bad design. So,
It does
and it's
seem.
why we now have frameworks,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
the frameworks are now addressing the problems that they have been
Right.
addressing in the first place. But now
Right.
we've got 25 different frameworks, which
Right.
essentially means we've got 25 different versions of HTML.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you've got you use one framework for your site, and then for whatever reason the framework dies, or they change the license, or it doesn't support all the browsers anymore. If you have to change your website, you have to rewrite your whole website rather than it being compatible.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
these are all ideas that we'd fought against in the beginning of the web. You know, trying to make it consistent so it worked everywhere,
Right.
and so they've broken essential features of the web that I hope in the future that we will one day be able to fix.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. It just seems to come in waves, move towards, data model type thinking, you know, uh, for a while, and then switch back to, heck, let's just embed a programming language and then sure everything is possible. Let's just
Yeah,
make it Turing complete and off we go. It just seems to be an endless toing and froing. But it is kind of scary at the moment to see, the AIs are, I think, also weaponizing that. We have this bizarre situation where, from a user experience perspective, arguably it's got its benefits, right? Where to some degree, subject matter experts can now use English to express what they want. But the result that they get back when they ask, say, Gemini for one of these things is a single page web application, which is, 75 kilobytes of JavaScript stuck inside a HTML body. And it might as well be encrypted for all intents and purposes.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, you're right. In fact, I intend to one of my plans for this coming year is to develop a talk on vibe coding.
Okay.
Because as you say, in a sense, it's the ultimate declarative programming language. You say, I want this, and off it goes and writes it, and you've got that thing. And I mean, that's always been possible if you've been the owner of a company. Then you've
Right.
been able to sit there and say, I want an application that does this, and then off goes a bunch of people and they create that for you, and you've got it. That's vibe coding. So directors of companies, have had the ability to vibe code for years. But the
Right.
problem is that current level of AI, and I don't know if you've seen, I have a talk that I'd been given a few times recently called "There's No I in AI."
I saw it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not intelligent. It's a great quote that I saw was, "We think it's intelligent for the same reason that we see the face of Jesus Christ on a piece of toast." That
Right. Right. Right.
that we interpret it as intelligent, but incorrectly because it's not intelligent. So vibe coding, I've heard people say, "Oh, well, it really does do great work," and I've also heard people say it's a disaster because I
Right.
have to spend more time checking the results than I would have done
Right.
writing it in the first place. In a way, writing code is the least of the work in many ways, because getting it running properly is where the work really is. And if the structure of the program is not in your head, then debugging what you've been given by somebody else is
Right.
absolute hell. And if
Y-
that
y-
thing is a large language model, which is basically is what it is. Of course, where's it learnt to program? By looking at all the programs on the internet. And so
Sure.
therefore it's only going to be average quality at best, because
Right.
because the world's programmers, many of them are not that great, and the code
Right.
that you see on the internet is not going to be necessarily fantastic.
Right.
So you get a result that is a bit distressing when you look at the details. And of course you get these things called hallucinations, which I just call errors, that they invent libraries that don't exist,
Yeah.
and somehow that's okay, because that's how the parrot works.
Right. Right.
So
Right.
so coding, it's an interesting approach. I see that if AI ever really did get intelligent, then it might be a useful thing to do. But at this stage, I'm not a
Um,
great fan.
I love the idea. I mean, I share your concern about some of the limitations of where we're at now, but I love the idea that quote. I can't remember again who said it recently, but that English is the cool programming language for the 21st century. I love that idea that I could. In fact, I did this myself, messing around with some of these little single page web applications where I'd asked the AI to generate the code, but then I also asked it to include a panel that included the prompt that generated the app. Um, that idea that the English expression of what the director asked the programmer to do, right, would be something that you could actually carry around as part of the program. Could be like a 21st century equivalent of kind of view source in a sense. Um,
Yeah, but it surprises me really, because I mean we're all brought up with these fairy tales of making a wish to the genie, and
yeah,
the
yeah.
genie interpreting exactly what you said, and you getting a terrible, terrible result. Like, oh, everything that I touch, I want to turn to gold. I mean, that's
Wow.
vibe coding as far as I'm concerned. And of course, then you never get to eat again. And in a way, English is not a language for defining a formal system. And
Right.
the example that I give is, if you go to a building site, then at the door, as it were, the gate, it says hard hats must be worn. And if you go on the London Underground, when you're about to step on the escalator, there's a sign that says dogs must be carried. Now, those two sentences, hard hats must be worn and dogs must be carried, have exactly the same syntax, but they have completely different meanings. And that makes English a rather poor choice for programming, because it's so easy for you to interpret in a different way to how the responder interprets it. Just like the genie, doing
Yeah.
exactly what you say, and that's, oh no, that's not what I meant.
Right. The same is true for all human languages, I guess. That's
Exactly. Yeah,
the track,
absolutely.
isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Does,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
does that not drag us somewhat uncomfortably back to the idea that the only way to capture it truly formally is good old-fashioned mathematics?
Well, you won't hear me complaining about that, but I mean, I mean, you do need some sort of formal system,
Mm,
and I mean that's why you get standards written in such formal language, and you know why the very formal meanings attributed to the words must, should, may, and so on, because
mm,
you've got to be able to interpret what the person said in an unambiguous way. So, it's actually tough work writing a standard in a way that nobody's going to misinterpret. And
right.
and that's the same idea as vibe coding, that you have to specify it in a
Indeed, yeah.
in a very formal way. And English is not designed to do that sort of things. I mean,
No, indeed.
the law is another example where they have to use very formal language in order to be unambiguous, and even so,
Well,
even in those cases, you still get the opportunity of finding loopholes,
indeed.
because it hasn't been defined very well.
Indeed. That's an area that I spent most of my career working on is structured documents in the legal sense of structured,
Right.
which
Hmm.
is a perfectly valid view of the world that lawyers carry around in their heads tends to be quite different from the view that computer scientists carry around in their heads. Um, but I've always been intrigued with that idea that one of the ways in which law deals with ambiguity is it lets it run. Now, if it would be so expensive in terms of effort, or impact on comprehensibility to spell it all out, um, instead they will leave a certain amount of ambiguity in, premeditated ambiguity,
Yeah,
knowing that if it becomes an issue, then you've got this convenient thing in common law systems called the courts, and then the courts can disambiguate, and that's a kind of a rolling corpus of interpretation, which itself is law,
yeah.
that accumulates over time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's a necessary feature of the whole system, that you have case law,
Mm.
and that is that when it's not clear what a law says, then the courts are allowed to interpret what they think that the people who invented the law meant. And of course, over the years that can change from a societal point of view, but I mean, it's necessary, but it's not ideal, I would say. I mean, ideally, more an ideal would be for the people specifying the law to say what they really meant, and to be no doubt about it. And having to have different people then try and make
Right.
interpretations of what was really meant is not an ideal approach. And I wouldn't want that for programming languages, for instance. If you defined a programming language, oh well,
Um,
what did they mean here? Well, let's invent something.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember someone telling me once that there was a lot of ambiguity, I think, in ways of interpreting pieces of PL1
Oh
back
yeah,
in the day,
PL1 was
where different.
terrible. And actually PL1 uh, was the first programming language that tried to interpret what you really meant, even if you hadn't specified it right. So I mean, it let you provide the wrong number of parameters to a function, and it would just do something. And that sort of thing is just so hard to track down when there's a mistake. If you've missed out one of the parameters or something, then you just get junk in that last place. So it was a bit of a disaster.
Mm,
And why I'm certainly for programming languages, I'm against the idea of being liberal in what you accept and strict in what you produce,
right,
because what it means is that there's no way to check if you've done it right in your production, because the thing just accepts what you've done.
mhm,
Um, and so if it looks okay in your browser, as it were, for instance, I mean,
right,
even HTML, I mean, HTML there are a lot of people who seem to think it's great that HTML fixes up what you've done, but I don't know how great that really is, because when you're writing by hand, certainly it's really hard by just programming it and putting it in the or writing it and putting it in the browser and then looking, oh yeah, that's what I wanted. That's fine to know that you've done it wrong.
mm,
And there's a contract between you and the browser that's not being not being validated. It's sort of just doing what it thinks you meant rather than doing what you actually meant.
right,
And so I think that, I mean, one of the reasons that so much HTML is so bad is simply because of that, because nobody really knows what's allowed and what's not allowed without having to jump through hoops.
right. In the world of law, a little bit like your example of carrying the dog on the escalator. One of the examples I use, trying to explain the nature of law with other software engineers who haven't worked with law as often as I have, is you take a harmless looking statement like, you know, don't sleep in the train station, and it's really easy to come up with reasons why it would be wrong to apply that literally. Someone nods off, sitting on a chair waiting for their train. So sitting there in a suit. So they are clearly sleeping in a train station. But within the spirit of the law, as opposed to
Right.
the letter of the law, what they're
Right.
doing is harmless, you know. But yeah, that whole business about making something really, really literal and explicit and leaving no room for ambiguity is just it just there's lots of scope there for just, you know, digging deeper and deeper holes, I think. Um,
But again, that's just bad specification. I mean, if
okay.
you say do not sleep in a railway station, but you mean in particular circumstances, then you should say those particular circumstances. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point to discuss how liberal should you be in what you accept. But I do think that it does a lot of damage, and it was applied in PL1 definitely
Mm.
that being liberal in what they accepted, and that made PL1 really hard to use simply
Right,
because
right,
debugging is 90% of the cost and the time of fixing a program, and if it
right.
doesn't tell you where you've made mistakes, then you're how do you know that there is
How do you
where the
know?
mistake is? Yeah.
Right. How
and
do you
and
know?
JavaScript does much of the, I mean, it tried to be too well, I mean, is too lax in a lot of what it does.
Right.
That is to say, it tries to accept things that are wrong and try and interpret it in some way or another. And that in the long run, that doesn't help the user at all. In fact, it gets in your way
Right.
because when the problem shows up, it's miles away from where the problem actually was caused,
Right.
which
Right.
was
Right.
interpreting something which you'd written wrong, in a different way to how you'd intended it. So,
Right.
I think that liberal acceptance rule in JavaScript is a big mistake. And
Yeah.
I've spent afternoons debugging other people's code. Um, exactly because JavaScript has been liberal in how it's interpreted what they've meant, and it was clear what they meant looking at the text,
Yeah.
but it worked differently.
So, what are your thoughts then, given all of that? What are your thoughts on the concept of reference implementations? I remember when Java came out and there was these JSP pages and all the rest of it. That's quite a few years ago, but I remember at some stage, Sun had an implementation of that called Tomcat, I think it was Apache Tomcat. Um, so there was some sort of specification document, JSR or something or other, I think it was. But I remember reading somewhere that the uh, Tomcat was declared to be the reference implementation. In other words, if there was ever any ambiguity, if you're reading the spec and you're still not sure, try it against Tomcat and see if Tomcat chokes or what Tomcat does. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, that makes then an implementation the definition. And I
Right,
mean, this was a problem with Fortran in the beginning. That the bugs in the original Fortran compiler were defined as canonical, as it were,
right,
so uh, that means that the mistakes in the specification are less important than the mistakes in the implementation. So I'm not a big fan. I mean, I mean, such implementations are useful to compare your own implementation against. But in the end, I think that the defining document should be the final definition. And if there's some ambiguity, then you should go back to the definers of the document and ask them to explain the ambiguity.
right, right. And I know you worked when you were working with the W3C. I know you worked on XHTML. I guess a thought that just ran through my head was, would you ever see a day where there would be an IHTML, sort of an invisible version of HTML?
Well, actually, Markdown is just that.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
exactly that in a way. So I think that already exists,
It
and
already exists.
I already have an XML grammar for one of the many Markdowns. I mean, again,
Okay.
Markdown is not defined officially anywhere, or defined in many different places in different ways. But
Right.
in one of my two tutorials that I mentioned, I develop an XML grammar for Markdown that
Wow.
turns it into to HTML. So
Right.
yeah, I mean, one of my dreams is to create an invisible XML version of X forms, because I think that there are, there are people who are happy writing directly in XML, angle brackets marked up, and there are people who aren't, and I mean that's really why you have CSS, and you don't have any XML version of CSS,
Right.
because people don't prefer to write directly in CSS or directly in JavaScript, or any other language. I mean, we think we think in terms of the structuring. We see the structuring with our eyes, and so we don't feel the need to add the structuring ourselves, just to make it easy for the computer, and we shouldn't. So, programming languages, or any sort of language, ought to be directed towards the user if the user has to look at them and deal with them. So, there are huge. I mean, most of the world wouldn't want to write directly in HTML or XML, simply because it's a language intended for instructing computers, and you want to just think in human terms. So, I mean, I think that's one of the big advantages of IXML, that you get the best of both worlds. You can write your data or your programming language, or in plain text, but the computer still gets a structured version of it that everybody can agree on.
Right.
Um,
Right. Right.
so a sort of a flat text version of Xforms would be a nice thing to have, and it's sort of something that I want to work towards by using IXML.
And is that you mentioned that the W3C are no longer doing XML work? Does that also include work on X forms?
Yeah, no, anything to do, anything that was in the XML activity
Mm.
got ended, and I kind of think it's short-sighted, um, but that's not really for me to say. I mean,
Right. Right.
it's my opinion,
Mm.
but I think there's, in the long run, um, structured approaches are going to be needed, and one of my talks is about the 100-year web, because we should be thinking about the web in terms of its longevity, because it's replaced very many things, like books. Many books,
Mm.
like encyclopedias, timetables, things like that, have all disappeared now and been replaced by the web. Great, but the people who produce the web, or produce websites, don't really properly understand their historical role in preserving data.
Hmm.
Because if I can read a book from 100 years ago, and even books that have only historical meaning. So, for instance, in the UK, there were Kelly's directories, which you used to find a company that was at a particular address. For every city it had, you just went through all the streets one by one, listing the companies that were working at those locations, and that was an interesting and useful resource in those days, but of course very time limited. But it gives us a lot of information about our history, and it's an important historical document to keep around. But these days, a huge amount, a distressing amount of websites just delete stuff when they think
Right.
it's no longer necessary for now. And that's because they don't realize that in 100 years' time, we might want that data. And
Right.
data is not expensive to keep. I mean, data is relatively small compared with everything that we're doing. So
Um,
it distresses me to see all this historical stuff disappearing. And I mean, where I work, they're just as guilty of, somebody leaves, goes on to a different job, then their homepage is just completely deleted without backups, and then everything they produced in their time when they were in that job is lost.
Brain.
And we at my work, we have a letter written by Einstein to somebody. We have a copy of, well, we have that actual letter, and that's sort of like a real historical document, really interesting stuff in there. But
Hmm.
if you delete everybody's emails and when they leave their job, then that sort of historical document completely disappears.
Indeed.
So 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 uh, so uh, um, we I think that when we think about the web, we should really be thinking about the future, 100 years time. How will people be able to get to this data?
Hmm.
And really, we it's going to be a bit of a disaster if the only way that people can look at the data we're producing now is by finding 100-year-old JavaScript interpreter, because because it's not declarative. It hasn't been
Uh-huh.
written in the declarative way, but a procedural way, and so the data is only available if you run the JavaScript on it. That's such a short-sighted approach to
Hmm.
what has become an essential part of our daily life, and needs much more attention than people are currently giving it.
Oh, indeed. It's become quite acute in the world of law, that where I spend a lot of my time, because um, law is full of citations, right? And increasingly those citations are, are ahrefs, right? They're ultimately hyperlinks. And so two problems. Well, firstly, gosh, hopefully the document is still there. Secondly, the links from a law perspective need to be contemporaneous. So it needs to be, when you dereference the URL, you're hoping to get back the artifact that was there when the author wrote the referencing document. And that's becoming a significant, that whole bit rot thing is becoming quite significant now.
All I can say is thank goodness for archive.org. I
Yeah, yeah.
mean, that is such, as far as I'm concerned, is a central part of the world's infrastructure. And
Right,
really, every government should be giving loads of money to archive.org, because the stuff that gets lost is only being saved by them, and they should have the resources in order to save the world's information for us. I mean,
right,
in the early days of the web, I was a bit naive, and because the idea was that you should never delete anything, URL should never change, and in the early days, I really believed that would happen, and so I've lost personally many pieces of information or documents that I really wish that I could be able to get back, but can't anymore just because they've gone.
um,
And I'm very distressed at the flippant way that data is just deleted because the current owners of it don't see how it could possibly be useful. And I mean, I'm guilty of some of this in myself in the past. We had an Apple Lisa that we were using seriously. And at a given moment, it was slow and heavy and big and in the way. And we just chucked it out
right,
at a point where Apple Lisa was not a valuable object because it
right.
only gained its value, 20, 30 years later. But, somebody said, what should we do with Lisa? And I said, oh, chuck it.
Yeah.
But of course, I mean, just the mouse of a Lisa is now worth like $500.
Hmm.
It's a valuable object, and so it's a lesson that I've learned the hard way. But
Yeah,
that's
me
also the
too.
truth. That's also the case with data. That
Yeah.
once it's gone, it's gone.
I threw out a Sinclair ZX80 Spectrum, an Apple IIe, a
Yeah,
Commodore 64, all of those things that, are now museum pieces that I wish I had.
yeah,
Um,
right, exactly,
I chucked them.
exactly. Yeah, yep, 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 yep,
But
yep, yep.
in the To what extent is that? I mean, I remember when earlier on when we talked about hyperlinks, I mentioned that uh, that many hypertext text theorists, when they saw ahref, were horrified because of the fact that it wasn't, it wasn't validating the endpoint, right? There was no guarantee that the thing was going to be there, right? The famous 404 error message. Um, that I suppose that hasn't helped, I guess. I can see why it was necessary for the web to become what it became and to grow as big as it did, and the decentralization aspect of it. What's the from Tim Berners-Lee's book, Weaving the Web? Is it hypertext subverts hierarchy, I think is the phrase Tim Berners-Lee used in his book.
Hmm.
So I can
Yeah.
see the logic behind it, but I think it might have contributed to that kind of flippant nature about, well, we don't need it, so we'll delete it. Who cares that there might be 10,000 links out there that are pointing into it?
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. You're not physically aware of the things
right,
coming in. You just see this thing sitting there. You no idea about how many people are using it or might
right, yeah,
might uh, might use it. It's true. I mean, of course, a lot of pragmatic decisions were made with the original web, and it's probably one of the reasons it was successful in the first place. It was easy to implement, and it scaled easily. I mean, of course, the other big thing in its favor was that it was free, um,
right,
which sort of encouraged people to adopt it against the things that it was competing against, where you had to pay a license fee.
right, right, right. And going back to Markdown for a second, I mean, I've seen a huge uptick in the amount of Markdown stuff going on because it seems to have somehow become the lingua franca for talking to AIs. How did that happen? Or I don't know how it happened. You probably know. I have no idea either. I'm guessing. I think it just organically grew, but it's like it's a thing now, isn't it? Whether it is.
It it is. Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the point is, it's easy to write with just a text editor,
Yeah.
and you want things to be headers, but there aren't many good editors for that sort of thing that are available for free and easy to use. Um, yeah, it's regrettable, really. For lots of different reasons. It essentially it's a compiled language. That is to say, you type it in one way, and then you push it through a process, and it comes out in a different way.
Mm.
And there's research that's shown that compiled languages like LaTeX and Markdown actually produces worse quality writing than if you use a WYSIWYG system.
Okay.
There have been research into this that using a WYSIWYG system produces higher quality and higher quantity as well. That you get a better result with WYSIWYG, and
Right.
therefore it's a backward step going well. I'm anti-LaTeX as well, but Markdown is also a backward step because it encourages, but people aren't aware of this. It encourages bad writing, or it produces bad writing or worse writing. It's bizarre, but it's how tools affect how you work. If you've got a power tool, then you can do something much faster than if you've got a hand tool, and with a power tool you can probably do a better job as well. So the tools that you have available to you affect the quality of what you produce, and it turns
Mm.
out that things like Markdown are actually bad tools.
Right. 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 Is that because of the badness of the user experience of just being stuck within a text editor? Is that something that could be fixed with tooling, or is
Well,
there
well,
something else
yeah,
going
yeah,
on?
yeah, fixed with tooling by going to a WYSIWYG system, basically.
I
I mean,
see. Okay,
yeah,
yeah, I see what
yeah,
you
yeah,
mean now.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
intriguing, isn't it? It's just
It is. It is. I mean, I
everything
mean,
ebbs and
it,
flows.
it's amazing, really, how these things, can. I mean, you wouldn't expect that that how you produce your writing whether it's a pencil on paper or with a word processor style where you have to compile it, or a WYSIWYG system, would affect what you write. But the
Right.
research says that it really does. So, for instance,
Wow.
writing with a pencil, you produce less, or a pencil or a pen, you produce less text but higher quality. With the markdown style, you produce more text but lower quality, and with the WYSIWYG system, you produce more text but higher quality.
Right. Intriguing. Very, very
Yeah, it
good.
is intriguing. It is, and which is why I don't do anything but in WYSIWYG if I'm writing, because I know this result.
Okay. All right. Okay.
So even my diary, I write in a WYSIWYG
WYSIWYG.
editor. Yeah, yeah.
Well, Stephen, we have been talking for just about an hour now.
Oh yes, so we
I'm
have.
so grateful for your time. It's been fascinating. We've covered an awful lot of ground, talked about
We
enough
have.
really interesting things. We could talk for hours, I'm sure.
I'm sure we could. Well, it's been great being here. I look forward to seeing the result.
Absolutely great. Lovely. Thanks very
Okay.
much for taking the time, Stephen.